And the term African American was dangerous to have at this time. It was rejected as a self-preservation. This was a community closing rank and say, we reject this term because we're Americans and we don't want to go anywhere. Where did the term African American come from? When did it start being used in the United States? These are really important questions, but what I think is even more important is understanding why the term African American fell out of usage in the 1800s and what brought it back. But today I want to expose a hidden chapter of American history, and let's just say you're probably not going to see this one coming. But first we need to talk about Fred Shapiro, because this is a man who's central to this story. He is a Yale Law School librarian, but he's also a linguistic detective. You've all heard the term African American. However you feel about it, maybe it's how you identify, maybe it's something you actually reject, maybe you're not really sure what term you're supposed to use if you're not of that ancestry. Well, most of us think it's a modern term, that it became popular during the time of Reverend Jesse Jackson, late 1980s, early 1990s, when he started pushing for this term. And it was officially documented in the Oxford Dictionary in 2001, and it didn't really show up on the US Census until about 2000. So a lot of folks say, well, this is a brand new term. But hold on. Fred Shapiro, who was an associate director at the Yale Law School and a librarian, and he's a regular contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is pretty incredible. He recently made a groundbreaking discovery. He found an instance of a man describing himself as African American in a 1782 printed sermon. That's right, 1782. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is why this term fell out of use, and it's pretty shocking. Let's go to 1782. He has all these Fred Shapiro has these databases. He was doing research, and what popped up during his research was an advertisement from May 15th, 1782. It was from the Pennsylvania Journal. And it was announcing that there were, quote, 2 sermons written by the African American on the capture of Lord Cornwallis to be sold. So I know you're thinking 1782, that's right around the time the United States became the United States. So the term African American has its origins literally at the beginning of our nation's birth. But why did folks stop using this term? And then why did it come back into favor in the 1980s and then fall back out of favor again? So we're going to come back to this 16-page pamphlet that was for sale. You can actually see the real thing online on Harvard, and I was reading through it myself. It's pretty awesome. It was pretty interesting to see, okay, so this term was being used by someone of African descent. This person, references being a descendant of Africa, so most likely born in the United States with ancestry going back to Africa. We don't know if this person was a freedman, an enslaved person, but we don't have that information. I want to use that as the starting point. 1782, this term is being used. It's understood, it's well known. Why did it fall out of favor? This is the story of the American Colonization Society, just founded in 1816 by a man named Robert Finley. He was a preacher and an educator. And the organization wasn't simply a society for the times, though. It had a mission, namely to facilitate the return of free Black Americans back to Africa. But the echoes of this initiative would reverberate in really unexpected ways. So in most cases, African American families had lived in the United States for generations. So at this time, my family on one side would have been considered an African American. Some of them were enslaved still at this time. And they had also been in the United States, though, for a couple of generations. Like, they were enslaved, but they were also Americans. These weren't Africans, right? The prevailing sentiment to these African American families was that they were no more African than anybody else. They had been living in America. They saw themselves as American. Frederick Douglass spoke on this very passionately and eloquently, that they had every right to consider themselves American as any of their contemporaries who were also born in America and had deep roots there, even if the families were not there voluntarily in the beginning. There was this movement, this idea of sending Africans back to Africa. And some enslavers, like Zephaniah Kingsley, would sometimes free their slaves on the condition that they had to leave the country immediately. So it's like, I'll free you, but you have to get out of here and not consider yourself an American anymore, which is strange because these are folks who, for the most part, had all been born here. Like, they were as American as anybody. There's this tension now of this idea of, well, these people aren't really American and they need to go back to where they came from. Facing the increasingly dominant voice of the American Colonization Society, the Black community decided to take a bold stance. So in 1835, Philadelphia was hosting what was called the 5th Annual Convention for the Improvement of the Free People of Color. So it's kind of a mouthful. And it was here with many discussions and debates, and the motion was crystal clear. This is what they said. Quote, "We recommend, as far as possible, to our people to abandon the use of the word colored when referring to themselves in speech or writing. Most importantly, the title African should be removed from their institutions, including even the engraved stones of the churches." So there's this movement to say we are distancing ourselves from this word African. And at the point, there were a lot of churches that were known as like the first African church of whatever, or the first African school of whatever. And so the community chose to redefine their identity on their own terms, distancing themselves from this idea that they should be sent back to Africa because of their African ancestry. And this history matters so much to all of us, whether or not you have African ancestry or not. It serves as this indicator of how much language and labels can shape and reshape the way we see ourselves and the way we see our history. They decide to abandon the term African American. It falls out of use. And they didn't want to use the term colored, like they said, so what do they replace it with? Well, we bump into the 1916 Negro Yearbook, which made an intriguing observation. And it stated, quote, "There's an increasing use of the word Negro and a decreasing use of the word colored and African American to designate us as a people. So the word colored was on decline, African was being rejected, and Negro was ascendant. Why?" Well, enter W.A. Domingo, who is the editor of the Negro World, who in 1919 penned an article that posed a compelling question. He said, "What are we, Negroes or colored people?" And he didn't mince his words. He argued that the word colored is objectionable. It tends toward this division of race, and it has no history. It's a makeshift term. He basically said, this doesn't mean anything. We shouldn't use this term. But the linguistic transformation didn't happen overnight. And there was a disagreement on the appropriateness of colored as a description, even back in 1835, though. And Samuel Cornish, who is the editor of The Colored American, wrote in 1838 this editorial. And I want to read to you how he saw that phrase. He said, "Oppressed Americans," referring to African Americans, "oppressed Americans, who are they? Nonsense, brethren. You are colored Americans. The Indians are red Americans, and the white people are white Americans, and you were as good as they, and they are no better than you. God made all of the same blood. Do not fool away any more of your time, nor fill up any more of your papers with such nonsense." And so here he's making this stance to say it's okay to call ourselves colored, and it's okay to call the Native Americans red Americans and the white Americans white Americans, and we're all still God's children. Blanche Kelso Bruce, who was the first Black man to serve a full term as a U.S. Senator, he said a simple but very powerful declaration. He said, quote, "I am a Negro and I'm proud of my race." So we see this distancing from African American, distancing from colored or people of color to Negro. If you fast forward a bit more, Booker T. Washington steps onto the stage. And in his 1895 Atlanta exhibition speech, he used the term Negro, but he avoided the term colored at all costs. And guess what? He also founded organizations like the American Negro Academy in 1897 and the National Negro Business League in 1900. And he even penned A New Negro for a New Century that very year. So there's this push now to use this word Negro. Along comes the Harlem Renaissance, which was initially known as the New Negro Movement, thanks to figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who published the book titled The Negro in 1915. And there was this explosion of cultural identity in Harlem in 1918. There was this new identity being carved out. And what they were calling the new Negro was described as a more outspoken, more radical, more resolved man as a group against the injustices of Jim Crow and segregation, which, you know, was happening at the same time as this. So this was the pushback. But there's this tension underneath this discussion of whether or not to capitalize the word Negro. And so if we rewind to 1878, there was an editorial in the Chicago Conservator, and it proclaimed, quote, "Spell it with a capital." This was an explicit call to use a capital N in Negro. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a towering intellectual at the time, he picked up the baton in 1899, and he even carried out a letter-writing campaign on this issue. He said, quote, "I believe that 8 million Americans are entitled to a capital letter." So a simple shift from lowercase n to capital N, and just like that, the word Negro carried a different weight in the community. But hold on. George Schuyler had a different perspective, and in 1930, he told the Pittsburgh Courier, quote, "It doesn't really matter a tinker's damn whether Negro is spelled with a small or large n. Basically, until we're treated with equality, it really doesn't matter what letter you use. Like, you're fighting the wrong battle." So there's this tension in the community, but overarchingly, there's this preference for this new title. But in the years to come, the term Negro found itself embattled and eventually replaced. Richard Moore in 1960 declared that the name Negro had been so tarnished that, quote, "it must be completely cast off and its further use wholly rejected." Well, enter Malcolm X and his organization of Afro-American Unity, pushing for the term Afro-American instead of African-American. And so by the late 1960s, you have Afro-American departments in colleges, at Harvard and Howard and Stanford. That's how they're describing these departments. There's the era of Black Power, and James Brown kind of like drove that home, you know, say it loud, I'm Black and proud. And so now again, we see another shift in the words that are being used to self-identify. But Gallup polls from 1968 to 1969, they showcased a significant shift from Negro to Black during this time, which is so interesting to see this. And I've also seen graphs and things that show when folks are self-identifying on the census over the last couple decades, older folks will choose the right in Negro. That's what they will choose to use. That's how they self-identify, because that was what they were told as children. Like that's how they understood their identity as children. But the newer generations have moved on from that. And so then on December 19th, 1988, the term African American made its re-entry into American society, cemented by none other than the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And he argued that to be called African American has cultural integrity. And, you know, he was referencing other people like, you know, Asian Americans and things like that. And he's saying, you know, we deserve that too. Like, let's embrace African American. And then when you're looking at this really interesting graph from the New York Times, it's showing the frequency of these terms. You know, you see Negro is just kind of slow and steady hanging. And then all of a sudden in 1988, there's this insane jump where, you know, African American has skyrocketed in use and preference at this time. And so, you know, when we move into modern times, there's tension with these terms. And I think for some of the younger generations, or previously younger generations like myself, I grew up hearing African American. Like, that's what seems comfortable to me. Hearing some of these other terms seem not only antiquated, but almost borderline offensive, but they weren't seen as offensive at their time of use. So there it is. The term African American is not a modern label. It has a deeply rooted phrase that actually goes back to the beginning of our nation's story and was a chosen description for those who had African ancestry. And one of the last organizations to use colored in its title was actually the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was founded in 1909. And normally they go by NAACP, even though the term colored is just not, now we say people of color, right? POC, but colored people is offensive. People of color is not, but still the NAACP hasn't changed, you know, its title since for the last 120 years that it has been around. And I think what was so shocking to me is the reason why the term African American had to be rejected. It was rejected as a self-preservation. This was a community closing rank and say, we reject this term because we're Americans and we don't want to go anywhere. And the term African American was dangerous to have at this time. It meant you could get kicked out of the country. And so if you're interested in hearing any more about the other side of the coin, President Abraham Lincoln's thoughts on sending freed men out of the country, I'll leave that video here. Thanks so much.